Story 1. The Phantom Convoy of Interstate 80. Marcus Chen had been running cross-country routes for 15 years, and Interstate 80 through Nevada was as familiar to him as his own living room. He knew every truck stop, every grade, every place where the cell signal dropped out in the vast stretches between Elko and Winnemucca. On the night of October 12, 2019, he was hauling electronics from Sacramento to Omaha, running his usual overnight schedule to avoid the daytime heat and traffic. The Kenworth T680 hummed beneath him, dash lights casting a soft green glow across his weathered face as he settled into the rhythm of the road. It was 2:47 a.m. when he first noticed the headlights in his mirrors. Marcus had been alone on this stretch for nearly 40 minutes, which wasn't unusual for a Wednesday night in the middle of nowhere. The lights appeared suddenly, as if materializing from the darkness itself, maintaining a steady distance about a quarter-mile back. He thought nothing of it at first. Another trucker, probably running the same tight schedule, keeping pace through the emptiness. But as the minutes stretched on, something began to feel wrong. The lights never got closer, never fell back. They just stayed there, perfectly maintaining that exact distance no matter how Marcus adjusted his speed. He tapped his brakes slightly, dropping from 70 to 65. The lights behind him remained fixed at the same interval. He accelerated back to 72. Still, that unchanging gap persisted. Marcus reached for his CB radio, keying the mic. Breaker 19. This is Rolling Thunder eastbound on 80 at mile marker 228. Got a driver behind me. You got your ears on. Static crackled back at him, empty and cold. He tried again on channel 19, then channel 9. Nothing but that hollow, whistling static that seemed to pulse with an almost organic rhythm. The highway stretched ahead, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the high desert. And Marcus realized he hadn't seen another vehicle, another sign of life, for over an hour now. No cars, no trucks, nothing at the rest stop he'd passed 20 miles back. Just him, the road, and those persistent lights in his mirror. That's when he noticed the second set of lights, then a third, then a fourth. They appeared one by one, materializing out of the darkness behind the first truck, forming a convoy that stretched back into the night. Marcus counted 12 sets of headlights, all perfectly spaced, all maintaining that exact impossible distance. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles going white. In 15 years of driving, through every kind of weather and every hour of the night, he'd never seen anything like this. The CB radio suddenly crackled to life, but it wasn't a voice. It was a sound like grinding metal, like brakes screaming, like the terrible moment before impact. Marcus jerked the volume down, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound continued, rising and falling in waves that made his teeth ache and his vision blur at the edges. He checked his GPS. According to the device, he was exactly where he should be, approaching mile marker 235, still 70 miles from Winnemucca. But something was wrong with the landscape outside. The terrain looked different, the hills arranged in patterns he didn't recognize. The mile markers, when they appeared in his headlights, seemed to be counting backward. 237, 236, 35, 224, 233. Marcus blinked hard, trying to clear his vision. The markers were definitely running backward now, but he was still driving east, still moving in the right direction according to his compass. The convoy behind him remained fixed in position, those 12 sets of lights burning steadily in the darkness. He decided to pull over, to let whatever this was pass him. There was a rest area coming up in 3 miles, according to his last memory of this route. He'd stop, take a break. Let these ghost trucks or hallucination or whatever they were go on without him. But when he looked for the rest area exit, it wasn't there. The highway just continued, straight and empty, mile markers still counting down in the wrong direction. The temperature in the cab began to drop. Marcus could see his breath fogging in the air, even though the heater was running full blast. Frost started forming on the inside of the windshield, creating intricate patterns that looked almost like writing. He cranked the defroster, but the frost only spread, creeping across the glass in defiance of the hot air blasting against it. Through the frosted windshield, Marcus saw something ahead. A truck stopped across both lanes, completely blocking the highway. It was an old Peterbilt, the kind they stopped making in the 70s, its chrome dulled with age and rust. Marcus slammed on his brakes, his load shifting slightly, as the Kenworth's air brakes engaged with a hiss. He came to a stop about 50 feet from the obstacle, his heart racing. The 12 trucks behind him stopped too, their lights still burning in his mirrors. But now he could see them more clearly. They were all old models, decades out of date, some with chrome and paint schemes from the 60s and 70s. And they were all completely identical, perfect copies of each other, down to the rust patterns on their grills. Marcus grabbed his phone. No signal. The GPS screen had gone dark, showing nothing but static. The radio continued its grinding, screaming noise, now interspersed with what might have been voices, might have been words, but played backward and distorted beyond recognition. He sat there, engine idling, not knowing what to do. He couldn't go forward. He couldn't go back. The temperature continued to drop, and now he could see ice forming on the steering wheel, on the door handle, on his own sleeve. Then the driver's door of the blocked truck ahead opened. A figure stepped out, and Marcus felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. The figure was wearing a trucker's jacket and cap, but there was something fundamentally wrong about its proportions, its movements. It walked toward Marcus's truck with a gait that was almost human but not quite, like someone who had learned to walk by watching videos but had never actually done it before. Marcus threw his transmission into reverse, but the Kenworth wouldn't move. The engine revved, but it was as if the truck was anchored to the highway, held in place by some invisible force. The figure kept approaching, and now Marcus could see its face, or rather, where its face should have been. There was only smooth skin, featureless and pale as milk. He grabbed the door handle, thinking he'd run, but his hand wouldn't move. His whole body had seized up, muscles locked in place by terror or cold, or something else entirely. The figure reached his door, and Marcus heard the handle rattle. The lock clicked open by itself. The door swung wide, and the faceless figure stood there, one hand extended toward him. The hand was wrong too many joints in the fingers, the palm creased with lines that formed patterns like circuit boards. Behind the figure, the 12 identical trucks began to move, pulling forward in perfect synchronization, surrounding Marcus's Kenworth. Then, suddenly, Marcus was moving again. Not of his own volition, but being pulled from his seat by invisible hands. He floated out of the cab, his feet dangling above the asphalt, suspended in the frigid air. The faceless figure tilted its head, as if examining him, as if trying to understand what he was. Marcus opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The world began to spin, or maybe it was just him spinning, rotating slowly in the air, while the convoy of ghost trucks circled around him. The highway beneath him began to fade, becoming transparent, and through it he could see other roads, other highways, stacked one upon another like layers of glass. On each one, trucks were driving, had always been driving, would always be driving. An infinite regression of vehicles traveling through an endless night. He saw dates flashing past on mile markers that existed in all dimensions at once. 1952, 1973, 1984, 2019, 2047, 2089. Time wasn't linear here, wasn't fixed. This stretch of Interstate 80 was something else. Some junction point, where all the roads and all the times intersected. Where every trucker who had ever driven this route still was driving, trapped in an eternal loop. The faceless figure released him. Marcus fell, but instead of hitting the pavement, he fell through it, through the layers of stacked highways, falling through decades and miles and dimensions. He had a moment to wonder if he'd ever stop falling, if this was how it would end, tumbling forever through the infinite roads. He hit something hard. His head cracked against it, and stars exploded across his vision. When he could see again, when the pain subsided enough for him to think, he realized he was sitting in his cab. His Kenworth was pulled over on the shoulder of Interstate 80, emergency flashers blinking. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the approaching dawn. Marcus checked his GPS with shaking hands. Mile marker 235. He'd lost 3 hours. His last clear memory was of passing mile marker 228 at 2:47 a.m. Now it was 6:15, and he had no idea what had happened in between. His CB radio was working normally, crackling with the morning chatter of truckers heading to breakfast stops and way stations. He got out of his cab on unsteady legs and walked around his truck, checking for damage. Everything looked normal. The load was secure, the tires fine, no sign of any problem. But when he looked at his windshield, he saw something that made his stomach drop. Scratched into the glass, as if etched by a fingernail or a piece of ice, were the numbers. 1952. Marcus got back in his cab and drove. He didn't stop until he reached Omaha. Didn't trust any rest area or truck stop along Interstate 80. He delivered his load, and then he called his dispatcher and told her he was done with cross-country routes. He wanted local work, day shifts, anything that would keep him off the highway at night. She asked him what happened, but he couldn't explain it. How do you tell someone you've seen the ghost roads, the places where time and space fold in on themselves? How do you explain that somewhere out there, on a stretch of Nevada highway, 12 identical trucks are still driving, still maintaining their perfect spacing, waiting for the next driver who happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? Marcus still drives trucks, but only regional routes now, never more than 300 miles from home, never at night. Sometimes, when he's on the highway during the day, he'll see an old Peterbilt or Kenworth from the 60s or 70s, lovingly restored and maintained. And he'll wonder if it's real, or if it's one of them, one of the phantom convoy bleeding through from that other place. The numbers scratched into his windshield never fully went away, no matter how many times he replaced it. They'd always come back, faint but visible in the right light. 1952. He looked it up once, searched for accidents on Interstate 80 in 1952. Of course, the interstate highway system wasn't even built then. The first section of I-80 didn't open until 1956, but he found references to a 2-lane highway that occupied roughly the same route, and a night in October 1952 when 12 trucks vanished without a trace, all driving in convoy formation. No wreckage was ever found, no explanation ever given. Just 12 trucks and 12 drivers, gone into the Nevada night like they'd never existed at all. Marcus thinks about them sometimes, wonders if they're still out there, driving their eternal route through the spaces between moments. He wonders if maybe he didn't escape at all. if maybe he's still out there with them. And this life, this world, is just a dream he's having in the endless seconds of falling through those stacked highways. He doesn't drive Interstate 80 anymore, and he never will again. Story 2. The Singing Woman of Route 66. Daniel Morrison had been hauling freight through the Southwest for 8 years when he took the run that would change everything. It was late July 2021, and the heat was murderous, the kind that made the air shimmer and dance above the asphalt. He was driving a load of construction equipment from Albuquerque to Cortez, Colorado, taking the old routes through northwestern New Mexico because a jackknifed semi had closed I-25 for the day. His GPS routed him through what locals still called Route 666, even though it had been officially renamed U.S. Route 491 back in 2003. The old number had a reputation, one that Daniel had always dismissed as superstitious nonsense, stories truckers told each other to pass the time. But the locals had insisted on renaming it, claiming the highway was cursed, that the devil's number attracted evil. Daniel didn't believe in curses. He believed in maintenance schedules, fuel efficiency, and keeping his logbook current. The supernatural was for movies and campfire stories, not for a professional driver with a spotless safety record and a family waiting for him in Denver. It was 10:37 p.m. when he saw her standing by the side of the road. She was maybe 30 feet ahead, clearly visible in his headlights, wearing a white dress that seemed to glow in the darkness. Her thumb was out, the universal sign of a hitchhiker, and she was smiling. Even from a distance, even through the bug-spattered windshield, Daniel could see that smile was all wrong. He'd been taught never to pick up hitchhikers. It was company policy and common sense. But something made him slow down anyway. Not kindness, not sympathy, but something else. A compulsion that seemed to bypass his conscious mind and go straight to his hands, his foot on the brake. The freight liner Cascadia slowed, air brakes hissing, and came to a stop right beside her. Up close, she was beautiful, in a way that made Daniel's skin crawl. Her features were perfect, almost too perfect, like a computer-generated image that had crossed into the uncanny valley. Her eyes were dark, impossibly dark, with no visible distinction between iris and pupil. And she was still smiling, lips pulled back to reveal teeth that seemed slightly too white, slightly too sharp. She climbed into the cab without waiting for an invitation, moving with a fluid grace that seemed to defy normal human mechanics. The interior light stayed off even though the door was open, and the temperature in the cab immediately dropped 20 degrees. Daniel tried to tell her to get out, that he couldn't take passengers, but his voice wouldn't work. His throat felt sealed shut, his tongue thick and useless in his mouth. "Thank you for stopping," she said, settling into the passenger seat. Her voice was wrong too, layered somehow, as if multiple people were speaking in perfect unison. "I've been waiting for someone to stop. I've been waiting such a long time." Daniel managed to make a sound, a strangled grunt of protest. The woman turned to look at him, her head rotating slightly too far, past the angle where a human neck should stop. "Drive," she said, and it wasn't a request. Daniel's foot pressed the accelerator. His hands worked the transmission, and the truck began to move, all without his conscious control of any of it. The highway stretched ahead, empty and black. Daniel realized he couldn't see any lights from houses or towns, nothing but the road picked out by his headlights, and the vast darkness pressing in from all sides. The mile markers were passing too quickly, far too quickly for the speed his speedometer showed. Then the woman began to sing, It started low, almost below the threshold of hearing, a humming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Daniel felt it in his bones, in his teeth, vibrating through the seat and the steering wheel. The sound built slowly, rising in pitch and volume, becoming words in a language Daniel didn't recognize, but somehow understood at a primal, instinctive level. She was singing about death, about lonely highways and the souls trapped on them, about drivers who made wrong turns and found themselves on roads that existed between places, in the spaces where reality grew thin, about the price of traveling through the night, through the empty places where humanity's light didn't reach. Daniel tried to cover his ears, but his hands wouldn't leave the steering wheel. The song grew louder, filling the cab, pressing against his eardrums until he thought they would burst. And with the sound came images, visions that bloomed behind his eyes, even though they were still open, still fixed on the road. He saw Route 66 as it had been decades ago, a 2-lane blacktop cutting through reservation land. He saw the accidents, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, vehicles crumpled and burning. He saw drivers who had died here, their last moments played out in horrible detail. He saw something else too, something that predated the highway, ancient and hungry, drawn to this place by blood and violence and the thin spot between worlds. The woman's song reached a crescendo, and Daniel realized with mounting horror that he was singing too. His mouth was moving, his voice joining hers in that alien language, those terrible words that spoke of things humanity was never meant to know. He tried to stop, tried to bite down on his own tongue, but nothing worked. He was a puppet, his strings pulled by something vast and incomprehensible. The landscape outside changed. The road was still there, still passing beneath his wheels, but the terrain had transformed into something impossible. The desert had become a forest of twisted, petrified trees that reached toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The stars overhead were wrong, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at, constellations that had never existed in Earth's sky. Daniel's truck was climbing now, even though the road appeared flat. He could feel the strain on the engine, the gear ratios wrong for the grade. His altimeter showed they were ascending rapidly, already 5,000 feet higher than they should be on this route. 6,000, 7,000. The air pressure in the cab was dropping, his ears popping painfully. The woman turned to face him fully, and Daniel saw that the white dress wasn't fabric at all. It was made of something organic, something that rippled and moved like skin, like the surface of a cocoon. Her face was changing too, the beautiful features melting away to reveal something underneath, something with too many eyes and a mouth that opened in layers. "You're almost home," she said in that multiplied voice. "You're almost where you belong." The truck crested a rise, and Daniel saw what lay ahead. A city, vast and impossible, built from wrecked vehicles. Trucks, cars, buses, RVs, all piled and stacked and fused together into towering structures that defied geometry. Between the twisted metal spires, figures moved, things that might once have been human, but had been changed by their time in this place, reshaped into something else. In the center of it all was a hole. Not a pit or a canyon, but a hole in reality itself. A tear in the fabric of space that showed nothing beyond. It was toward this that the road led, arrow straight, and Daniel realized with absolute certainty that if his truck went over that edge, he would fall forever, tumbling through an infinite void where time and space had no meaning. He tried again to stop, to brake, to turn the wheel, but his body refused. The woman was still singing, her song now punctuated with laughter that sounded like breaking glass. The hole grew larger, closer, its edges rimmed with that same petrified wood from the forest, reaching across the void like a frame. Daniel closed his eyes. If he was going to die, going to fall into that impossible darkness, he didn't want to see it coming. He thought of his wife, Sarah, and his 2 daughters, Emma and Claire. He tried to remember their faces, their voices, tried to hold on to something real and good as the world around him dissolved into nightmare. The singing stopped. The truck lurched, and Daniel's stomach dropped as if they'd gone over the edge. He waited for the endless fall, but it never came. Instead, he heard sounds. Normal sounds. The rumble of his diesel engine, the hiss of air brakes, the crackle of his CB radio. Daniel opened his eyes. He was sitting in his truck on the shoulder of US Route 491, pulled over in a rest area. Morning sunlight streamed through the windshield, warm and real. His hands were shaking on the wheel, and his shirt was soaked through with sweat, despite the air conditioning running at full blast. He looked at the passenger seat. Empty. No sign that anyone had been sitting there. But the seat was pushed back, adjusted for someone taller than Daniel, and there was a smell in the cab, something sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in a vase. Daniel's logbook showed he'd lost 6 hours. According to his GPS and his own memory, he'd entered Route 491 at 10:30 p.m. It was now 4:30 a.m., but he'd only traveled 37 miles. The math didn't work, couldn't work, not unless he'd been driving at 6 miles per hour the entire time, which his fuel consumption proved he hadn't. He checked his phone, hands still trembling. 7 missed calls from his dispatcher, 3 from Sarah. He called his wife first, heard the relief in her voice when he answered, the questions he couldn't answer. Where had he been? Why hadn't he answered his phone? Was he okay? He told her he'd fallen asleep, pulled over when he felt tired. It was a lie, but what else could he say? That he'd been to a city built from wrecks, that he'd almost driven into a hole in reality, that a woman who wasn't human had commandeered his truck and sung him songs about the death of worlds. Daniel drove the rest of the route in daylight, delivered his load, and turned around immediately, taking interstate highways all the way back, avoiding Route 491 entirely. He told his dispatcher he wasn't comfortable with rural routes anymore, wanted to stick to major highways. She argued, but eventually accepted his request. 3 weeks later, Daniel was reading online news when he saw a story that made his blood run cold. A trucker named Kevin Hughes had been found dead in his cab on US Route 491, pulled over in the same rest area where Daniel had awakened. No obvious cause of death, no signs of foul play. But according to the report, Hughes's logbook showed he'd been driving the route for over 15 hours, even though the distance covered was impossible for that time. And witnesses at a truck stop 70 miles away swore they'd seen Hughes that morning, looking terrified, claiming a woman in white had been singing to him. The coroner's report mentioned something else, something that wasn't in the news story, but that Daniel found by digging through public records. Hughes's body was found in a state of advanced mummification, as if he'd been dead for months, not hours. His eyes had been open, and in the reflection of his pupils, preserved by the dry desert air, investigators had photographed what looked like structures made of metal and glass, arrangements that shouldn't have been physically possible. Daniel quit long-haul trucking entirely after that. He works at a warehouse now, loading and unloading trucks, never driving more than 10 miles from home. Sometimes late at night when he can't sleep, he hears singing. It's distant, barely audible, but it's there. The same melody the woman sang, the same words in that language he shouldn't understand but does. His wife asks him why he wakes up screaming, why he can't drive at night anymore, why he flinches every time he sees a woman in a white dress. He tells her it's stress, just stress from too many years on the road. Another lie, because the truth would sound like madness. But Daniel knows the truth. Route 66 was renamed, but some curses run deeper than names, deeper than asphalt and paint. Something lives in that stretch of highway, something that feeds on travelers, on the lonely and the lost. And sometimes, when it's hungry enough, it sends out a lure, a woman in white, with a smile like broken glass, and a song that can reshape reality. Daniel escaped, but Kevin Hughes didn't. And Daniel knows, with a certainty that keeps him awake at night, that there will be others. The woman is still out there, still waiting by the roadside, still singing her terrible songs to anyone foolish enough to stop. The highway still runs through that thin place, that gap in the world where things slip through from somewhere else. He'll never drive Route 491 again, will never even speak its old name aloud. But sometimes, when he's loading trucks at the warehouse, he sees drivers preparing for southwest routes, and he wants to warn them, wants to tell them about the singing woman, about the city of wrecks, about the hole in reality that waits at the end of the road. He never does. Because who would believe him? Who would believe any of it? So Daniel keeps quiet, keeps his nightmares to himself, and tries not to think about the fact that somewhere out there, on a dark highway under the wrong stars, his truck is still driving, still climbing toward that impossible city, his own ghost behind the wheel, singing along with the woman in white, forever. Story 3. The truck stop that wasn't there. Rebecca Bex Coleman prided herself on knowing every truck stop, rest area, and fuel station between Seattle and Miami. 22 years of running coast-to-coast routes had given her an encyclopedic knowledge of where to eat, where to sleep, and where to avoid. On the night of March 4th, 2020, that knowledge became completely useless. She was driving south on I-77 through Virginia, hauling fresh produce from Pennsylvania to Georgia, fighting to make her delivery window. A late start in Harrisburg had put her behind schedule, and now she was racing the clock, pushing the limits of her hours of service. Her co-driver, a younger guy named Travis, was supposed to take over at midnight, but he'd called in sick at the last minute, leaving Bex to handle the entire run solo. At 11:43 p.m., somewhere between Fancy Gap and Hillsville, her fuel gauge dropped into the warning zone. Bex cursed under her breath. She'd meant to fuel up an hour ago, but had gotten distracted arguing with dispatch about the delivery time. Now she was looking at maybe 40 miles of range, maybe less if the gauge was pessimistic. She grabbed her phone to check the nearest fuel stops, but there was no signal. Not unusual in this part of Virginia, where the mountains played hell with cell towers. Her GPS was installed in the A-dash, and it showed two options: a pilot station 32 miles ahead and a smaller independent stop 8 miles back. Going backward would kill her schedule, but running out of fuel would be worse. Then she saw the exit sign, bright green, retro-reflective, clearly visible in her headlights. Fuel, food, lodging, 1 mile. No exit number, no mention of a specific brand, but fuel was fuel. Bex took the exit, her Peterbilt 5N climbing the gentle ramp away from the interstate. The exit road was well maintained, smooth asphalt with fresh yellow lines. It curved through dense forest, the trees pressing close on both sides, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the stars. Bex followed the road for what felt like more than a mile, much more. but her odometer showed she'd only gone 0.8 miles when the truck stop appeared. It was enormous, far larger than any independent stop had a right to be. The parking lot could have held 200 trucks easily, and the main building was a sprawling structure of glass and steel that looked more like a modern airport terminal than a rural fuel station. Bright lights illuminated everything, harsh and white, making Bex squint after the darkness of the road. But the parking lot was empty, completely empty. No trucks, no cars, nothing. Just acres of fresh asphalt and those brilliant lights creating pools of illumination in the forest night. Bex pulled up to the diesel pumps, feeling uneasy but unable to articulate why. Everything looked normal, looked modern and clean and professional. The fuel island had 8 pumps, all new-looking digital displays glowing blue. Signs advertised DEF, a rewards program, a convenience store with fresh coffee and hot food. She shut down her engine and climbed out of the cab. The silence was absolute. No traffic sounds from the interstate, even though she was only a mile away. No insects, no night birds, nothing. Just that oppressive, tomb-like quiet that pressed against her eardrums. The fuel pump activated when she touched it, display lighting up with instructions. Bex swiped her fleet card, entered her PIN, selected diesel. The pump authorized, and she began fueling, watching the gallons tick up on the display. Everything was working normally, but the feeling of wrongness was growing stronger. She looked at the main building. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see aisles of merchandise, coolers full of drinks, a hot food station under warming lights. But there was no one inside. No clerk behind the counter, no customers browsing the aisles. Just empty, perfect retail space, fully stocked and completely abandoned. The fuel nozzle clicked off. 120 gallons, more than her tanks should hold. Bex frowned at the display, confused. Her truck had dual saddle tanks with a combined capacity of 200 gallons, and they'd been about a quarter full when she pulled in. She should have taken on maybe 130 gallons maximum, and that was if she filled to the brim. She looked at her fuel gauge. Still in the warning zone, showing less than a quarter tank. Bex tried the pump again, but it wouldn't authorize. The display showed her transaction as complete, receipt printed and waiting in the slot. Something was very wrong. Bex grabbed the receipt and walked toward the building, thinking she'd find someone inside, a clerk who could explain the fuel gauge discrepancy, maybe call someone to check her tanks. The automatic doors slid open at her approach, and a wave of cold air washed over her, carrying a smell that made her stop in her tracks. It was the smell of rot. Not garbage, not food gone bad, but organic decay, like something dead hidden beneath floorboards. Bex took a step back, but the doors stayed open, that cold, fetid air continuing to pour out. "Hello?" she called. Her voice sounded flat, absorbed by the space rather than echoing. "Anyone here?" No answer. Bex looked back at her truck, sitting alone under the lights. She should just leave, should get back on the road, and sort out the fuel issue later. But she was a professional, and professionals didn't run from empty buildings and strange smells. Besides, she'd just put fuel on her fleet card. She needed to make sure the transaction was legitimate. She stepped inside. The automatic doors closed behind her with a soft hiss, and the silence became even more complete. The fluorescent lights overhead were too bright, creating harsh shadows and making everything look slightly unreal, slightly too vivid. The aisles were fully stocked with every conceivable truck stop item. Snacks, drinks, trucker supplies, clothing, electronics. But everything was slightly off. The brands were wrong, names she didn't recognize. The packaging looked normal at first glance, but the fonts were strange, the colors not quite right. A candy bar labeled Snickers, but spelled Snickers. A soda called Coca-Cola. Energy drinks with names like Red Bullet and Monster Fuel. Bex picked up a bag of chips, something labeled Lay's Classic Potato Chips. But when she turned it over, the ingredients list was in a language she didn't recognize. Not Spanish or French, but something else. Characters that almost looked like English letters but weren't. Arranged in patterns that made her eyes hurt to read. She dropped the bag and backed away from the shelf. This was wrong. All of it was wrong. She needed to leave, needed to get out of this place and back to somewhere real, somewhere that made sense. Bex turned toward the exit, but the doors were gone. She was standing in the same place. She was sure of it. But where the automatic doors had been, there was now just a wall, floor-to-ceiling windows showing the empty parking lot beyond. She ran along the windows, looking for any door, any way out. The building seemed to stretch as she moved, growing longer, more aisles appearing, more shelves of impossible products. The smell of decay was getting stronger, and underneath it, Bex could hear something. A sound like breathing, slow and rhythmic, coming from everywhere and nowhere. Then she saw the other customer. A man in trucker clothes, standing at the end of an aisle, his back to her. He was perfectly still, so still he might have been a mannequin. But Bex could see his chest moving, see the slight sway that indicated a living person. "Excuse me," Bex called out, walking toward him. "Do you know how to get out of here?" The man didn't respond, didn't turn around. Bex got closer, close enough to see that his jacket was old, decades out of style, the kind of denim and patches that truckers wore in the 80s. Close enough to see that his hair was gray with dust, matted and unwashed. "Hey," she said, reaching out to tap his shoulder. "Are you okay?" Her hand connected with his jacket, and the man collapsed. Not fell, not stumbled, but collapsed, his body breaking apart into a cloud of dust and fragments that scattered across the floor. There was nothing inside the clothes, nothing but empty space and decay. The jacket and jeans crumpled to the ground, surrounding a pile of dust that might once have been a human body. Bex screamed and stumbled backward. Her foot caught on something, and she fell, landing hard on the floor. She rolled over and found herself face to face with another pile of clothes. These ones more recent, maybe from the 90s. Shoes, jeans, a flannel shirt, all surrounding that same telltale dust. There were more. Now that she knew what to look for, Bex could see them everywhere. Dozens of piles of clothing scattered through the aisles, decades of styles, each one marking a person who had come to this place and never left. Some of the piles were ancient, rotted clothing from the 60s or earlier. Others were recent, modern athletic wear and work clothes. Bex scrambled to her feet and ran. She didn't know where she was going, just away from the clothes and the dust and the terrible implications. She crashed through aisles, sending products flying. That breathing sound getting louder, turning into words, syllables in a language she almost understood. The building was a maze now, endless corridors of shelves that turned back on themselves, creating impossible geometries. Bex recognized that she was passing the same locations multiple times, but from different angles, as if the space was folding, as if she was moving through more than 3 dimensions. She found a fire exit, a red door with a crash bar. Bex hit it at full speed, expecting alarms, expecting resistance, but the door opened easily, and she fell through into darkness. Not the parking lot, not outside, but absolute, complete darkness that had texture and weight. Bex fumbled for her flashlight, the small LED unit she kept on her belt. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing concrete floor, concrete walls, some kind of service corridor or basement. She followed the corridor, taking turns, at random, just trying to find a way up, a way out, a way back to the world she understood. The corridor opened into a larger space, and Bex's flashlight revealed what she'd been dreading. Trucks, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, parked in neat rows in an underground garage that shouldn't exist. They were all styles and eras, classic Kenworths and Peterbilts next to modern Freightliners and Volvos. All perfectly preserved, all empty. Bex walked among them, her flashlight playing across chrome and paint. Every truck had its driver's door open, inviting, waiting. She looked inside one, a beautiful classic 1970s Kenworth W900, and saw the keys in the ignition, a logbook open on the passenger seat. The last entry was dated March 15, 1979, final destination listed as Atlanta. She checked another truck, a Mack from the 90s. Last logbook entry, November 3rd, 1996. Another, a Volvo barely a few years old, February 22nd, 2019. All stopped here, all abandoned, drivers gone. Bex's flashlight was dimming. She shook it, and the beam brightened momentarily, then began to fade again. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and in that darkness she saw movement. Not people, not anything solid, but shadows within shadows, forms that slid along the walls and ceiling, reaching toward her with appendages that were almost but not quite arms. She ran again, blindly, her dying flashlight barely showing the way. She crashed into trucks, scraped against walls, fell and got up and kept running. The breathing sound was all around her now, and the shadows were getting closer, touching her hair, her clothes, leaving cold trails on her skin. Bex's hand hit a wall, and she felt a door handle. She grabbed it, twisted, pulled, and fell forward into blinding light. She hit asphalt, rolled, came up on her hands and knees, gasping for air. She was in the parking lot, the empty, well-lit parking lot of the truck stop that wasn't there. Her Peterbilt sat where she'd left it, lights still on, engine still running even though she distinctly remembered shutting it down. The fuel nozzle was hanging in the pump, transaction complete. Bex didn't stop to think. She ran to her truck, climbed in, released the brakes, and pulled away from the fuel island. She didn't look back, didn't check her mirrors, just drove toward the exit, toward the road that would take her back to the interstate. But there was no exit. The parking lot just continued, acres of empty asphalt, ringed by those dense, dark trees. Bex drove in what she thought was the right direction, but every path led back to the main building, back to those floor-to-ceiling windows that showed impossible aisles inside. She pulled out her phone. Still no signal. Her CB radio was static, nothing but hissing white noise. Her GPS showed her position as a blinking dot in empty gray space. No roads, no landmarks, nothing. Bex drove in circles for what felt like hours. The fuel gauge never moved, stuck on a quarter tank, no matter how long the engine ran. The clock on her dash stayed frozen at 11:58 p.m., never advancing. She was trapped, caught in this place just like all those other drivers, the ones who had become piles of dust and abandoned vehicles. Then she remembered the receipt. Bex pulled it from her pocket with shaking hands and looked at it in the dome light. Most of it was normal, listing the fuel type and amount, the price, her fleet card number. But at the bottom, where the address should be, there was only one line. Exit not taken becomes exit closed. Bex stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. The exit. The one she'd passed, the one she'd been too worried about her schedule to take. If she'd stopped there, at the real fuel station 8 miles back, none of this would have happened. She'd chosen convenience, chosen this exit, that appeared at exactly the right moment, and that choice had led her here. But the receipt said more, in tiny print along the perforated edge. All sales final. All choices permanent. All debts paid in time. Time. Bex looked at her clock again, still frozen at 11:58. 2 minutes before midnight. She'd been living in those 2 minutes for hours, trapped in a moment that never ended. But maybe, just maybe, if she could push forward, if she could break through to midnight, time would start again. She revved the engine, aimed her truck at the main building, and floored it. The Peterbilt surged forward, accelerating across the parking lot, speedometer climbing, 60 miles per hour, 70, 80. The building rushed toward her, those massive windows reflecting her headlights. Bex closed her eyes and waited for the impact. Glass shattered, metal screamed, airbags deployed, and the world became noise and chaos and darkness. Then silence. Then nothing. Bex woke up, slumped over her steering wheel, horn blaring. Someone was banging on her door, shouting. She lifted her head, confused, disoriented. A state trooper was standing on her running board, looking concerned. "Ma'am, are you all right? You've been sitting here with your horn going for the last 10 minutes. Bex looked around. She was parked at a fuel island, but not the impossible truck stop. This was a regular pilot station, older and worn, busy with trucks and cars. Dawn light was breaking over the horizon. What time is it?" she managed to ask. The trooper checked his watch. 6:15 a.m. "You're at the pilot in Hillsville. Clark called us because you pulled in, parked, and haven't moved since. Are you having a medical emergency?" "Hillsville?" Bex checked her GPS. Sure enough, she was 70 miles south of where she'd last remembered being. And somehow, 7 hours had passed. Her fuel tanks were full. Her fleet card showed a transaction at this pilot station at 11:47 p.m. last night. A normal transaction, normal fuel amount. The state trooper had her step down from the truck, did some basic coordination tests, checked her pupils. He seemed satisfied that she wasn't drunk or high, just exhausted. He suggested she get some sleep before driving further, maybe see a doctor when she reached Georgia. Bex thanked him and climbed back into her cab. As the trooper walked away, she pulled out the receipt from last night, the one from the impossible truck stop. But it was just a normal pilot receipt, listing normal fuel, normal price, normal address in Hillsville, Virginia. Except for one detail. At the very bottom, in tiny print, were the words, "Thank you for choosing us. We'll be waiting when you need us again." Bex quit trucking the next day. She broke her contract, paid the penalties, and took a job dispatching for a local delivery company. She never drives at night anymore, never takes exits she doesn't recognize, never stops at fuel stations that appear too convenient, too perfect. But sometimes, late at night, when she's at the dispatch office, she sees them on the highway cameras. Trucks pulling off at exits that don't exist, disappearing from the interstate and never reappearing. Drivers reported missing, vehicles never found, families left with questions that have no answers. And Bex knows where they went. They found the truck stop that wasn't there, the place that exists in borrowed time, in that space between 11:58 and midnight. They made the same choice she made, took the same exit, and unlike her, they never made it out. She keeps the receipt, that normal-looking pilot receipt with its wrong final line. It's a reminder of how close she came, how easily she could have become one of the piles of dust in those impossible aisles. And it's a warning, because she knows the truth now. Some exits lead nowhere good, and sometimes nowhere is exactly where you'll stay forever. Story 4. the load that changed weight. James Rutherford had been hauling specialized cargo for 12 years, the kind of stuff that required extra permits and careful handling. On August 19, 2018, he took a job that should have been simple. Transport a sealed container from a private facility in Nevada to a research laboratory in Massachusetts. The pay was exceptional, nearly triple his usual rate, but the conditions were specific and strange. The cargo was loaded at a nondescript warehouse complex outside of Tonopah, about 30 miles from the old nuclear test site. James wasn't allowed to see what went into the container, wasn't allowed to ask questions. A team of technicians in clean room suits supervised the loading, using a forklift to place a large black metal crate into the 40-foot container on his flatbed. The crate itself was maybe 8 feet on each side, perfectly cubic, with no visible seams or markings. "Don't open the container," the lead technician told him, a thin man with nervous eyes behind thick glasses. "Don't inspect the load. Don't stop for more than fuel, and required rest breaks. If anything unusual happens, call this number immediately." He handed James a card with a phone, number, and nothing else. No name, no organization. James had hauled military cargo before, had done runs for government contractors. This had that same feel, that same atmosphere of secrets and need to know. He secured the container, checked his chains and straps, and signed off on the paperwork. According to the bill of lading, the cargo weighed 12,000 pounds, well within limits for his Mac Anthem and flatbed trailer. He hit the scales at the weigh station outside Tonopah. The display showed his gross weight, 48,000 pounds. Tractor, trailer, and cargo, everything within specifications. James logged the weight and headed east on Highway 6, planning to cut across to I-70 and make a straight shot to the East Coast. The first night was uneventful. James drove through Nevada and into Utah, stopped for fuel in Green River, grabbed some food, logged his required rest break. Everything normal. The cargo sat on his flatbed, that black container with its mysterious cubic contents, undisturbed and unremarkable. It was on the second day, crossing Kansas on I-70, that things started getting strange. James stopped at a weigh station near Salina, a routine check. He pulled onto the scales, expecting the familiar process, the quick weight verification and clearance to proceed. The weighmaster came out of his booth looking confused. He walked around James's truck, checked the displayed weight, then checked it again. Finally, he waved James into the parking area and approached his cab. "You got a problem with your cargo?" the weighmaster asked. He was an older man, gray-haired and experienced, someone who'd seen thousands of trucks over the years. "No, sir," James replied. "Everything's secure. Hasn't been touched since loading in Nevada." "Your weight's off," the weighmaster said. "You came through our scales yesterday evening, eastbound, right? Around 11 p.m. James checked his logbook. He had come through this same weigh station last night, barely 12 hours ago. "Yes, sir, that's right. Is there a problem?" "Yesterday you weighed 48,000 pounds. Today you're showing 62,000. The weighmaster consulted his clipboard. "That's 14,000 pounds added overnight. You pick up something along the way." James felt ice forming in his stomach. "No, sir. I stopped for fuel and rest, that's all. Haven't opened the container. Haven't added anything to the load." They went through his paperwork, checked his seals, verified that the container hadn't been tampered with. Everything was in order, seals intact, no signs of additional cargo. But the scales didn't lie. His truck was 14,000 pounds heavier than it had been 12 hours ago. The weighmaster finally let him go with a warning to get his scales checked. noting the discrepancy in his file. James pulled back onto the highway, hands shaking slightly on the wheel. Cargo didn't just gain weight by itself. It was physically impossible. He tried the number on the card, but it went straight to a voicemail that didn't identify the organization or person, just a toneless beep. James left a message explaining the weight discrepancy and kept driving. That night, parked at a rest stop outside of Columbia, Missouri, James did something he'd been told not to do. He got out of his cab and walked back to inspect the container. The seals were still intact, but something had changed. The container itself felt different, looked different. The metal seemed darker, seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And when James put his hand against the side, he felt vibration, a steady pulsing that seemed almost organic. He pressed his ear against the container. Inside, he could hear sounds, not mechanical sounds, not the creak of metal or the shift of cargo. Something else, something like breathing, slow and deep, and underneath that, a sound like whispered voices speaking in rhythm. James jerked away from the container, his heart hammering. Whatever was in there, it wasn't equipment, wasn't any kind of normal cargo. He thought about opening it, about breaking the seals and seeing what he was transporting. But something deep and primal told him that would be a terrible mistake, that some things were better left unseen. He got back in his cab and locked the doors. Sleep was impossible. Every sound from outside made him jump, and he kept expecting to see the container opening, to see something emerging into the darkness. When the sun finally rose, James had never been more grateful for daylight in his life. He hit another way station in Indiana. The scale showed 78,000 pounds. The cargo had gained another 16,000 pounds overnight. James was over gross weight now, technically illegal to be on the highway. But when the weighmaster checked the scale, frowned, and ran the truck through again, the display changed. Back to 48,000 pounds, the original weight from Nevada. "Scale must be acting up," the weighmaster muttered. "You're good to go." James knew the scale wasn't malfunctioning. The cargo was changing, growing, expanding within that sealed container. And now it was affecting reality around it, making the scales show different weights, making people see what it wanted them to see. He called the number again. This time someone answered, a woman's voice, calm and professional. "Report your location and current status." "I'm in Indiana, about 2 hours from the Ohio border," James said. "The cargo is gaining weight. It's up to almost 80,000 pounds from the original 12. And there's something wrong with it, something moving inside." There was a pause. "Continue to the destination," the woman said. "Do not deviate from the route. Do not open the container under any circumstances. You'll receive a bonus payment for the inconvenience." "What am I hauling?" James demanded. "What's in the container?" "Classified materials. That's all you need to know. Continue to the destination." The line went dead. James sat there, holding his phone, wanting to refuse, wanting to drop this load and walk away. But he'd signed a contract, had already come over 1,000 miles. And something told him that walking away from this cargo might be worse than delivering it. That whatever was in that container might not appreciate being abandoned. He drove on through Ohio and Pennsylvania, watching the landscape pass by, trying not to think about the weight growing on his flatbed. Every time he looked in his mirrors, the container seemed larger, bulkier, as if it was expanding beyond its original dimensions. But when he stopped and measured it with his tape, it was still exactly 40 feet long, exactly 8 feet wide, exactly 8 feet high. The same dimensions it had been when loaded. The sounds from inside were louder now. James could hear them even over the road noise, even with the radio on. Breathing and whispering and something else. Something like laughter, but pitched too low for human vocal cords. And the temperature around the container was wrong. Even in the summer heat, the air near the flatbed was cold. Frost forming on the metal chains, despite the 90-degree weather. James crossed into New York State, then into Massachusetts. He was less than 3 hours from the delivery location, a facility outside of Worcester that his GPS marked as restricted access. He'd deliver this nightmare cargo, collect his payment, and never take another specialized job as long as he lived. The truck began to labor on hills, struggling with the weight, even though the scales still showed 48,000 pounds to anyone who checked. James downshifted earlier, worked the gears harder, felt his engine straining in ways it shouldn't with a legal load. The cargo's real weight was affecting the truck now, couldn't be hidden anymore. Then, on a rural stretch of Route 2, the truck stopped. James hadn't braked, hadn't done anything, but the Mac Anthem was no longer moving forward. The engine was running, the transmission was engaged, but they weren't going anywhere. It was as if the truck had been anchored to the earth, held in place by something beyond mechanical failure. James looked in his mirrors and felt his sanity threatening to crack. The container was opening. Not the doors, not any normal way, but splitting down the middle, the metal peeling back like skin, revealing what was inside. The black cube was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer metal, but something organic, pulsing with internal light that shifted through colors that didn't exist in normal spectrum. And it was growing, visibly expanding, doubling in size even as James watched. The container around it was fragmenting, pieces falling away as the cube outgrew its housing. James grabbed his door handle, ready to run, but his hand wouldn't move. His whole body had locked up, paralyzed like he'd been frozen in place. He could see, could breathe, could think, but couldn't move a single muscle. He was trapped in his seat, forced to watch as the cube continued to expand. It was humming now, a sound that James felt in his bones, in his teeth, in the fluid of his eyes. The pitch was rising, moving through subsonic frequencies into something almost painful. And with the sound came visions, images flooding James's mind without his consent. He saw the facility in Nevada, saw it as it really was, not a warehouse but a containment site. He saw the technicians, saw them not as human, but as something wearing human shapes, something that had learned to mimic humanity, but had gotten the details wrong. He saw the cube as it had been when they found it, buried in the desert, ancient and alien and waiting. He saw what it contained. Not equipment, not materials, but something alive, something that existed in more dimensions than human senses could perceive. Something that had been sleeping, trapped in that cube, by forces that predated human civilization. And he saw what the delivery was supposed to accomplish. The laboratory in Massachusetts wasn't a research facility. It was another containment site, a prison designed to hold things like this, things that had been collected over decades and centuries, kept locked away from the world. But this one was waking up. The transportation, the vibration, the change in location had roused it from dormancy. And now, it was too late to contain, too late to stop whatever was about to happen. The cube reached a critical mass and stopped growing. It sat on James's flatbed, now the size of a small house, pulsing with that impossible light. Then it began to sink, pressing down through the trailer, through the asphalt, into the earth beneath. James's truck tilted as the ground gave way, and suddenly he could move again. He threw open his door and jumped, hitting the asphalt hard and rolling. Behind him, his truck was being pulled down, dragged into a hole that was opening beneath it. Not a sinkhole, not anything geological, but a deliberate opening, as if the earth itself was swallowing the cube and everything connected to it. James ran. He didn't look back, didn't try to save his truck or the cargo. He just ran, legs pumping, lungs burning, putting distance between himself and whatever was happening on that rural Massachusetts highway. He heard the sound of collapsing, of metal and earth being compressed and consumed. He heard something like a door closing, a massive, final sound that shook the ground and rattled windows in nearby houses. Then silence, absolute and complete. James collapsed in a ditch, gasping for air. When he could finally move again, when he could think clearly, he walked back toward where his truck had been. The highway was intact, unmarked, showing no sign of damage. His truck was gone, the cube was gone. Even the skid marks from his emergency stop had vanished. There was nothing but empty road and early morning sunlight. A car drove past, the driver giving him a curious look. James flagged them down, asked to borrow their phone. He tried calling the number on the card, but it was disconnected, the number no longer in service. He tried calling his dispatch, but they had no record of the job, no paperwork for a load from Nevada to Massachusetts. The police picked him up eventually, a trucker walking on the highway without his vehicle. He tried to explain, but even to his own ears it sounded like madness. They took him to a hospital, had him evaluated, kept him overnight for observation. When he was released, he found his bank account showed the bonus payment had been deposited. Triple his normal rate, just as promised, with no record of who had sent it or why. James's truck was found 2 weeks later in an impound lot in Worcester, intact and undamaged. According to the lot's records, it had been towed from a breakdown on I-90, abandoned by its driver. There was no flatbed trailer, no container, no sign that he'd been hauling anything at all. His logbook showed only a personal vehicle moved from Nevada. No cargo, no specialized permits. He tried to find the facility in Tonopah, the place where the cargo had been loaded. The address on his paperwork led to an empty lot, vacant for years, according to local records. The research laboratory in Massachusetts didn't exist, at least not at the address he'd been given. James quit trucking entirely. He sold his truck, moved back to his hometown in Oregon, took a job at a hardware store. He doesn't talk about what happened, doesn't try to make people believe. He knows they wouldn't, knows it sounds like a breakdown or a hoax or delusion. But sometimes, late at night, he feels that vibration again, that pulsing rhythm like the heartbeat of something vast and alien. He feels it in the ground beneath his feet, in the walls of his house, in the air around him. And he knows the cube is still out there, still growing, still sinking deeper into the earth. He wonders sometimes what it is, what it wants, where it came from. But mostly he tries not to think about it, tries not to remember the visions it showed him, the glimpses of things human minds weren't meant to comprehend. And he never, ever hauls specialized cargo again. Whatever they're paying, whatever they're transporting, it's not worth the cost. Because some loads aren't measured in pounds or tons. Some loads are measured in sanity, in reality, in the fundamental laws of physics. And some loads change weight not because they're growing, but because they're pulling more of themselves into our world, manifesting across dimensions 1 pound at a time, until they're finally heavy enough to tear through the fabric of space and go home. James thinks that's what the cube was doing. Not escaping, but returning, using his truck as a vector to move from wherever it had been imprisoned to wherever it belonged. And if he's right, then somewhere deep beneath Massachusetts, in layers of earth and rock that humans will never excavate, something alien is still traveling, still sinking, heading for a destination beyond human comprehension. The cargo reached its delivery point, just not the one in the paperwork. Story 5. The Voices in the CB Static. Patricia Trish Nguyen had been a long-haul driver for 19 years when the voices started talking back. She was hauling auto parts from Detroit to Phoenix in late November 2017, running the southern route through Oklahoma and Texas to avoid the early winter storms hammering the northern states. Her CB radio was her lifeline, her connection to other drivers, her way of staying awake through the long, lonely hours of darkness. Channel 19 was where truckers lived, sharing information about traffic, police, weather, and road conditions. Trish had heard every kind of conversation on that channel over the years. Bored drivers telling stories, couples using it as a dating service, cranks spouting conspiracy theories. She'd learned to filter the noise, to pick out the useful information, and ignore the rest. On the night of November 23rd, somewhere between Oklahoma City and Amarillo on I-40, Trish picked up a new voice on her CB. It was a man, older sounding, with a distinct accent that reminded her of old movies, the kind of mid-Atlantic speech pattern that hadn't been common since the 50s. "This is Ghost Rider, westbound on 40, the voice said, looking for information on road conditions ahead. Any drivers near Amarillo got their ears on. Trish keyed her mic. "Ghost Rider, this is Pacific Runner. I'm about 90 miles east of Amarillo. Roads are clear, no weather issues. You should have smooth sailing." There was a pause, longer than normal for CB communication. Then the voice came back. And there was something odd about it, something that made Trish's skin prickle. "Pacific Runner, what year is it?" Trish frowned at her radio. "What year?" "It's 2017, friend. You okay?" Another long pause. 2017, the voice repeated. 32 years. I've been driving for 32 years. "That's a good career," Trish said, thinking this was just an older driver getting philosophical about his time on the road. "You thinking about retirement?" "I retired in 1985, Ghost Rider said. "Jackknifed outside of Amarillo during an ice storm. Truck went off an overpass. They tell me I died on impact." Trish's hand tightened on the mic. This was weird, way past normal CB weirdness. Probably some kid with a radio playing pranks, or a drunk driver who'd gotten hold of a CB and was messing with people. "Okay, Ghost Rider," she said carefully. "That's quite a story. I'm going to let you go now." "Wait," the voice said, and there was urgency in it now, desperation. "Please wait. I need to understand. What highway is this? What route am I driving?" "You said it yourself, friend. Interstate 40, westbound." "No," Ghost Rider said. "This isn't Interstate 40. This is Route 66. I'm hauling electronics from St. Louis to Los Angeles, same run I've done 100 times. It's December 15th, 1985, and there's a storm coming in. I can see it on the horizon, all black and terrible." Trish felt cold, despite the heater running in her cab. The voice sounded completely sincere, completely convinced of what it was saying. "Route 66 is gone, friend. Has been for decades. They replaced it with the interstate system." "No," Ghost Rider repeated. "It's right here. I'm driving it right now. I can see the old signs, the Burma Shave ads, the motor courts. This is Route 66, and I need to get to Amarillo before the storm hits." Trish didn't know what to say. She was about to sign off, to switch channels and forget this strange conversation, when another voice broke into the channel. "Pacific Runner, this is Midnight Express. I'm hearing your conversation with Ghost Rider. Don't engage, just switch channels and keep driving." This voice was different, a woman's voice, younger, with a note of fear underlying the words. Trish keyed her mic. "Midnight Express, what's going on? Who is this guy?" "Switch channels," Midnight Express insisted. "Trust me on this. Some conversations aren't meant for living ears." But before Trish could respond, Ghost Rider came back on, his voice rising in panic. "The storm's here. Oh God, it's here. There's ice on the road. Black ice. I can't see the lanes. I'm losing control. The trailer's swinging out. I can't." There was a sound then that Trish would never forget. A sound that came through her CB speakers with crystal clarity. The screaming of brakes, the crash of metal, the shattering of glass, and underneath it all, a human scream cut short. Then static, pure and empty. Trish sat in her cab, hands shaking on the wheel. She'd just heard someone die, or a recording of someone dying, or something. She didn't know what, but every instinct was screaming at her that it wasn't a prank, wasn't a recording. It was real, somehow, in a way that defied rational explanation. "Midnight Express, you still there?" Trish keyed her mic, needing answers, needing someone to explain what she'd just heard. "I'm here," the woman's voice replied. "You okay?" "What was that? What did I just hear?" "A loop," Midnight Express said. "A recording that plays itself over and over, trapped in the static between stations. There are dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all along the old routes. Drivers who died on the road. Their last moments caught somehow in the electromagnetic spectrum, playing out forever." Trish wanted to argue, wanted to dismiss this as nonsense, but she couldn't. She'd heard the terror in Ghost Rider's voice, heard the genuine confusion and fear. "That's impossible," she said, but the words sounded hollow even to her. "Is it?" Midnight Express replied. "You've been driving how long? 19, 20 years. You've never picked up weird signals before? Never heard voices that shouldn't be there?" Trish had, actually. Over the years, she'd occasionally caught fragments of conversations that seemed wrong, vintage somehow, using terminology and slang that was decades out of date. She'd always assumed it was old recordings someone was playing as a joke, or atmospheric conditions bouncing signals from far away. But now, with Ghost Rider's death scream still echoing in her ears, she wasn't so sure. "Who are you?" Trish asked. "How do you know about this?" "I'm someone who listens," Midnight Express said. "Someone who's been documenting these loops for years. And I'm warning you, Pacific Runner, don't respond to them. Don't engage. The more you talk to them, the stronger they get, the more real they become." Before Trish could ask what that meant, another voice broke into the channel. This one was different again, a man's voice, younger, with a southern accent. "Breaker 19, this is Cottonmouth, northbound on 35. I'm looking for my wife. Has anyone seen a red Peterbilt older model license plate, Texas Charlie Bravo 4792? Midnight Express immediately responded, her voice sharp. "Cottonmouth, this is Midnight Express. When are you?" "What?" Cottonmouth sounded confused. "When am I?" "It's October 3rd, 1997. My wife left our house this morning for a run to Wichita, but she never arrived. Her company says she's missing, but I know she's out here somewhere. I've been driving all day, calling on the CB, trying to find her." "Cottonmouth," Midnight Express said gently. "Your wife had an accident. Her truck went off Route 35 near the Kansas border. It was in the news on October 4th, 1997. I'm sorry, but she's gone. There was a long silence. Then Cottonmouth spoke again, his voice breaking. No, that's not right. I'm going to find her. I'm going to keep driving until I find her. You've been driving for 20 years, Midnight Express said. You're going to drive forever. That's what happens. You get stuck in the loop, in the last day, reliving it over and over, always searching, never finding. I don't understand, Cottonmouth said. I'm in my truck right now. I can see the highway, see the other cars. This is real. I'm real. You were real, Midnight Express replied. Past tense. You died, Cottonmouth. Heart attack, 3 days after your wife's accident. Died behind the wheel on this same highway. And now you're driving it forever, stuck in the day before, always looking for her. Always one day too late. Trish listened in horror as Cottonmouth tried to process this information, tried to argue, tried to deny. His voice began to fade, breaking up into static, and then he was gone, leaving only the empty hiss of the channel. How many are there? Trish asked Midnight Express. How many voices trapped like that? I've documented 214 distinct loops, Midnight Express said. But there are probably more. Frequencies I haven't accessed. Conversations I haven't heard. Every driver who died with unfinished business, with something left undone, they get caught. The CB radio was their last connection to the world, and now it's their prison. Why are you doing this? Trish asked. Why document them? Because someone should remember, Midnight Express replied. These were real people once, real drivers with families and dreams and lives. Now they're just ghosts in the static, playing out their deaths and their last moments over and over. Someone should bear witness. Someone should remember their names. Over the next hour, as Trish drove through the darkness toward Amarillo, more voices came and went on the CB. Some were clearly from the past, using outdated slang, referencing roads that no longer existed. Others were from accidents, last moments broadcast on the CB, as trucks crashed or drivers died. And a few were like Cottonmouth, ghosts searching for something they'd lost, unaware they were dead, unable to accept their own demise. Midnight Express provided context for each one, information she'd gathered over years of listening. She knew their names, their stories, the dates they died, where their accidents occurred. She was creating an oral history of the highway, a memorial built from radio static and electromagnetic echoes. Why are you telling me this? Trish finally asked. Why explain it to me? Because you listened, Midnight Express said. Most drivers, they hear a weird voice, they switch channels and forget about it. But you listened. You asked questions. That means you're someone who cares, someone who might help. Help how? By remembering, Midnight Express said. By bearing witness. These loops are fading, Pacific Runner. The old CB technology is being replaced. The frequencies are being reassigned. The electromagnetic environment is changing. In another decade, maybe 2, the voices will be gone, lost forever. But if people remember them, if people tell their stories, then they won't disappear completely. Trish was approaching Amarillo now, the city lights visible on the horizon. Who are you really? She asked. And don't give me a handle. Who are you? There was a long pause. I'm Sarah Chen, Midnight Express finally said. I was a trucker, long haul, like you. 23 years on the road. Then I had an accident outside of Memphis. Rollover on a slick highway. I died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. Trish felt her blood turn to ice. You're one of them. You're a loop. Yes and no, Sarah replied. I'm different. I didn't get trapped in my death moment. I got trapped in the CB itself, in the technology. I can hear all the channels, all the frequencies, all the voices. I exist in the static between transmissions, documenting, recording, trying to give these lost souls some dignity in their endless repetition. How is that possible? Trish whispered. I don't know, Sarah said. Maybe because I was keying my CB when I died, trying to call for help. Maybe because I loved these roads so much, loved the community of drivers, that some part of me couldn't let go. Or maybe it's just random, just chance, just the universe being strange and cruel. Trish drove in silence, processing this impossible information. She was having a conversation with a dead woman, a ghost that lived in CB radio frequencies, documenting other ghosts who were trapped in their own electromagnetic loops. I have to go now, Sarah said. There are other channels, other voices calling out. But Pacific Runner, remember what you heard tonight. Remember Ghost Rider and Cottonmouth and all the others. Tell their stories. Make sure they're not forgotten. Wait, Trish said. Will I hear from you again? Maybe, Sarah replied. If you listen on the right frequency, on the right night, when the atmospheric conditions are perfect. We're all out here, Pacific Runner. All of us who gave our lives to the road. We're still driving, still talking, still trying to connect. We're just doing it from the other side now. The channel went silent, returning to the normal traffic of living drivers, discussing road conditions and fuel prices. Trish drove the rest of the way to Amarillo in a daze, her mind reeling from what she'd experienced. She pulled into a truck stop and got out on shaky legs. In the restaurant, surrounded by other drivers, she felt the pull of normalcy, the temptation to dismiss everything as a hallucination brought on by fatigue. But she knew it was real. The voices had been real. Sarah Chen was real. The loops were real. Trish pulled out her phone and started searching. She found Sarah Chen easily enough. An obituary from 2009, a trucker who had died in a rollover accident outside Memphis. There was a photo, a woman in her 40s, smiling, standing beside her truck. She looked competent, professional, someone who had loved her work. She searched for Ghost Rider next, trying variations of accidents on I-40 near Amarillo in December 1985. It took longer, but she found it. Jerome Watson, 53, died when his truck jackknifed during an ice storm and went off an overpass. He'd been hauling electronics from St. Louis to Los Angeles, exactly as the voice had said. Cottonmouth took even more digging, but eventually Trish found a news story from 1997. Thomas "Tommy" Whitaker had died of a heart attack while searching for his missing wife, Karen, who had been killed when her truck went off Highway 35 near the Kansas border. Tommy had been found dead behind the wheel 3 days later, still driving the route where his wife had died. They were all real. Every voice, every story, every ghost in the static had been a living person once, someone with a life and a family and a reason to keep driving. And now they were trapped, forever reliving their last moments, their last journeys, unable to move on. Trish finished her coffee and went back to her truck. She picked up her CB mic and keyed it, not sure what she was going to say, not even sure if anyone would hear. "This is Pacific Runner," she said into the static. "For Jerome Watson, Ghost Rider, who died in 1985 trying to outrun a storm. For Karen and Tommy Whitaker, separated by death, forever searching for each other. For Sarah Chen, who died but stayed to remember the others. And for all the drivers we've lost, all the voices trapped in the static, I'm bearing witness. I'm remembering. You're not forgotten." There was no response, just the empty hiss of the CB. But Trish felt better for saying it. Felt like she'd fulfilled some obligation, paid some debt to the road and the drivers who had given everything to it. She drove on to Phoenix, delivered her load, and headed back to Detroit. But she never forgot what she'd heard that night. She started documenting the voices herself, keeping a journal of the strange transmissions she picked up, the ghosts who spoke through her CB during lonely night drives. Over the years, she collected dozens of stories, dozens of voices. She wrote them down, preserved them, made sure they weren't lost. And sometimes, on channels that shouldn't exist, frequencies that weren't officially allocated, she'd hear Sarah Chen again, still documenting, still bearing witness to the lost souls of the highway. Trish retired from trucking 5 years ago. She lives in Oregon now, in a small house with good internet. She runs a website dedicated to the voices in the static, a memorial to all the drivers who died on the road and somehow got caught in the electromagnetic spectrum, their last moments preserved like insects in amber. People sometimes send her recordings, strange CB transmissions they've picked up, voices that don't seem quite right. Trish listens to each one, researches the stories, tries to identify the drivers. It's become her life's work, her way of honoring the road and the people who gave everything to it. And on certain nights, when the atmospheric conditions are right, when the solar wind charges the ionosphere in just the right way, Trish turns on her old CB radio and listens. She hears them out there, all the lost voices, all the trapped souls, still driving their eternal routes, still calling out to anyone who'll listen. She answers them sometimes, lets them know someone's listening, someone remembers. She doesn't try to free them, doesn't know if that's even possible. She just bears witness, preserves their stories, makes sure they're not forgotten. Because in the end, that's all any of us can hope for, to be remembered, to have our story told, to know that when we're gone, someone will say our name and keep some part of us alive. The highway never forgets, and neither does Trish Nguyen, the woman who listens to ghosts and tells their stories to the living. Story 6. The Mile That Repeats. Victor Castellanos had been running the I-10 corridor between Los Angeles and El Paso for 14 years when he encountered the mile that wouldn't end. January 9th, 2019, was supposed to be a routine run, hauling agricultural equipment westbound through the Arizona desert. Victor knew this route like he knew his own reflection. Every exit, every landmark, every place where the highway changed character. He entered Arizona from New Mexico at 3:47 a.m., passing through the agricultural inspection station without incident. The night was clear, temperature hovering around 40 degrees, perfect driving conditions. Victor settled into the rhythm of the road, his Volvo VNL purring smoothly along the empty interstate. He was 15 miles west of Lordsburg when he passed mile marker 3. This was normal, expected, the first marker after the state line. Victor noted it unconsciously, his mind already running through the logistics of his fuel stop in Tucson, still over 200 miles ahead. 5 minutes later, he passed mile marker 3 again. Victor blinked, confused. He must have misread it, seen a 3 when it was actually 13 or 23. He checked his GPS. It showed him at mile marker 6, continuing west as expected. Just a trick of tired eyes and darkness. But 3 minutes after that, mile marker 3 appeared again in his headlights. Same marker, same location, same everything. Victor felt a chill run down his spine, despite the warmth of his cab. This wasn't right. This wasn't possible. He slowed down, watching his GPS carefully. The device showed him moving steadily west, his position updating normally, mile markers advancing in proper sequence. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. But every few minutes, his headlights would illuminate mile marker 3, sitting there on the shoulder like an accusation. Victor keyed his CB radio. Breaker 19. This is Desert Fox westbound on I-10 near the New Mexico line. Any other drivers in the area? Static answered him. Victor tried different channels, but they were all dead. Just empty hissing that seemed somehow expectant, as if something was listening but choosing not to respond. He checked his mirrors. Empty highway behind him, empty highway ahead. No other vehicles, which wasn't unusual for this time of night in this desolate stretch. But the absence felt deliberate now, felt wrong. Mile marker 3 appeared again. Victor checked his odometer against his GPS. According to the GPS, he'd traveled 18 miles since entering Arizona. According to his odometer, he'd only traveled 3. The numbers didn't match, shouldn't match, couldn't match unless one of them was lying. Victor pulled over at the next mile marker 3 and got out of his cab. The night air was cold and still. No wind, no sound, except the tick of his cooling engine. The landscape was pure Arizona desert. Scrub brush, distant mountains, empty sky full of stars. Everything looked normal except for the marker itself. Mile marker 3 was a standard green sign with white lettering, the kind the Department of Transportation installed by the thousands. But when Victor approached it, he saw something that made his stomach drop. The sign was new, the paint fresh, the metal uncorroded. But underneath the 3, barely visible, he could see ghost images of other numbers. A 7, a 12, a 23, a 45. Like someone had painted over the same sign dozens of times, changing the number but never quite covering what came before. Victor got back in his truck and drove. He wasn't going to spend the night parked next to a haunted mile marker in the middle of nowhere. He'd push through, get to Tucson, and report some kind of signage error to the Department of Transportation. But he couldn't push through. No matter how long he drove, no matter how fast he went, mile marker 3 kept appearing. Sometimes it was 3 minutes between sightings, sometimes 10, once nearly 20. But it always came back, always sat there on the shoulder waiting for him. That same green sign with its layers of ghost numbers underneath. Victor checked his fuel. He'd been driving for over an hour since entering Arizona, but his fuel gauge had barely moved. His GPS showed him approaching Lordsburg, then Wilcox, then Benson, towns streaming past on the digital display, even though he could see nothing out his windshield, except empty desert, and that damned mile marker appearing over and over. He tried to stop again, tried to pull over and figure out what was happening. But this time, his truck wouldn't slow down. Victor's foot pressed the brake, but the pedal had no effect. The truck maintained its steady 70 miles per hour. Cruise control apparently locked on, even though Victor hadn't set it. Panic rising, Victor tried to throw the transmission into neutral, but the gear selector wouldn't move. He tried to shut off the engine, but the key wouldn't turn. He was trapped in his cab, traveling at highway speed through a mile of road that repeated endlessly, unable to stop, unable to change anything. The sun should have been rising by now. Victor checked the time on his dashboard clock. 4:23 a.m. The same time it had been for the last hour. Time had stopped along with his forward progress, locking him into a perpetual pre-dawn moment. Then, Victor saw the other truck. It was ahead of him, maybe a quarter mile, also traveling west. Relief flooded through him. Another driver, proof that he wasn't alone, wasn't crazy. He flashed his lights, tried the CB again, but got no response. The other truck just maintained its speed, maintaining that exact distance. As he watched, the other truck passed mile marker 3. Victor expected it to disappear, to vanish like his progress vanished every time he passed that marker. But the truck remained visible, solid, real. And as Victor drew closer, he could see details. It was a Kenworth, older model, green paint faded by sun and weather. Victor's blood ran cold. He knew that truck. He'd seen it before, years ago. It belonged to Raymond Cruz, a driver Victor had known, a friend who had disappeared on this exact stretch of highway in 2006. The truck had been found abandoned at a rest stop. Raymond nowhere to be found. No explanation for where he'd gone. The case had never been solved. But here was Raymond's truck, still driving, still running this route 13 years after its driver vanished. Victor accelerated, trying to catch up, trying to see if Raymond was somehow behind the wheel. But no matter how fast he went, the Kenworth maintained that exact distance, close enough to see but too far to reach. More trucks appeared. One by one, they materialized in the darkness ahead, all traveling west, all passing mile marker 3 and continuing to exist, building into a convoy. Victor recognized some of them. A freightliner that had been involved in a fatal accident here in 2011. A Mack that had simply stopped responding to dispatch calls in 2015. A Peterbilt that had been reported stolen in 2008 and never recovered. They were all here, all driving this eternal mile, all trapped just like Victor was becoming trapped. He counted 12 trucks ahead of him, spanning over a decade of disappearances and unexplained incidents on this stretch of I-10. Victor tried everything he could think of to escape. He yanked the wheel hard to the right, trying to drive off the highway, but the truck stayed perfectly in its lane as if guided by invisible rails. He tried smashing his window, thinking he could climb out, but his fist bounced off the glass without cracking it. He tried using his emergency hammer, the tool kept under his seat for exactly this kind of situation, but it had no effect on the window. The landscape outside began to change. The desert was still there, but it was wrong now, twisted. The scrub brush had grown too tall. The mountains had moved closer. The stars overhead were arranging themselves into patterns that hurt to look at. This wasn't Arizona anymore, wasn't anywhere that existed on normal maps. Mile marker 3 appeared again, but now Victor could see it was glowing, emitting a faint green light that pulsed like a heartbeat. And as his truck passed it, Victor felt something pull at him, felt something hook into his chest and tug, trying to pull him out of his body, trying to drag some essential part of him into the marker itself. He understood then. The mile wasn't repeating. He was repeating. Every time he passed the marker, a copy of him was being made, a ghost version that stayed behind while the original moved forward. But there was no forward anymore, no destination. There was only the mile, only the marker, only this eternal moment of driving toward nothing. The convoy of ghost trucks was still ahead, but they were fading now, becoming transparent. Victor could see through them, see the highway beyond, see more mile marker 3s appearing like a forest of green signs, stretching to infinity. His hands were fading too. Victor looked down at them on the steering wheel and saw them becoming translucent, losing solidity. He could see the wheel through his fingers, could see the dashboard through his palms. He was being erased, dissolved, transformed into another ghost on this haunted highway. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His voice was gone, absorbed into the silence of the mile. His vision was dimming, the world growing darker, even as those impossible stars grew brighter overhead. Victor's last coherent thought was a question. How many times had he already died? How many copies of him had been left behind at mile marker 3, trapped forever in this repeating moment? Was this the first time, or the 100th, or the 1000th? Then everything went black. Victor opened his eyes. He was sitting in his truck, which was pulled over on the shoulder of I-10. Daylight streamed through the windshield, warm and real. His hands were solid. His body was solid. Everything seemed normal. He checked his GPS. It showed him at mile marker 47, about 30 miles west of where he'd entered the repeating mile. His clock showed 9:15 a.m. Somehow, 5 hours had passed. His logbook showed normal driving, normal mileage, as if nothing had happened. Victor got out of his cab on shaking legs. He walked back along the shoulder, looking for mile marker 3, but the markers here showed 47, 46, 45, counting down normally. No repeating numbers, no ghost images, no green glow. He completed his delivery in Los Angeles, but the experience haunted him. He started researching disappearances on I-10 in Arizona, looking for patterns. He found dozens of cases over the years. Trucks found abandoned, drivers vanished, no explanation. And he found something else. Survivor reports. Drivers who claimed to have experienced strange phenomena on that stretch of highway. Repeating mile markers. Time loops. Disappearing trucks. Most of the reports were dismissed as hallucinations brought on by fatigue. But Victor knew better. He'd been there, had experienced it, had nearly been erased by whatever lived in that mile of highway. He avoided I-10 after that, would take any alternate route, would drive hundreds of miles out of his way to avoid that section. Other drivers told him he was being superstitious, paranoid. But Victor didn't care. He'd seen the ghost convoy, had felt himself dissolving into the highway, had barely escaped with his existence intact. 3 months after his experience, Victor read about another disappearance. A driver named Thomas Walsh had vanished on I-10 near the New Mexico border. His truck was found parked at mile marker 3, engine running, logbook showing he'd been driving in circles for hours. The fuel tank was empty, but the odometer showed he'd only traveled 3 miles since his last fuel stop. Victor drove to the location, though it terrified him to return. He had to know, had to see. When he arrived at mile marker 3, he got out of his car and examined the sign. Fresh paint, clean metal, no visible age. But when the sunlight hit it at the right angle, Victor could see them. Ghost images of numbers underneath the 3. Dozens of numbers, maybe hundreds, layers upon layers of painted-over markers. And at the bottom, carved into the metal post that held the sign, were initials. Hundreds of pairs of initials, scratched by drivers who had stopped here over the years. Victor found his own initials near the top, fresh and recent. He had no memory of carving them, but there they were. VC, along with a date from 6 months ago. 6 months ago, before his experience with the repeating mile. The initials were dated 6 months in his future, but they were weathered, looked old, looked like they'd been there for years. Victor understood then. Time didn't work right near mile marker 3. The past and future collapsed into each other, creating loops and paradoxes. He had carved those initials, would carve them, was carving them in some other timeline or dimension. He was trapped in the same kind of loop as the highway, repeating himself across time. He ran back to his car and drove away, never looking back. But he knows he'll return. Someday, 6 months from now, or 6 months ago, or in some other timeline entirely, he'll come back to mile marker 3. He'll park his car, get out, and carve his initials into the post. Then he'll get back in his truck, start driving west, and enter the mile that repeats. And this time, he won't escape. This time, he'll join the convoy of ghost trucks, driving forever through a mile that has no end, passing a marker that exists in all times and no time, trapped in the space between moments. Victor still drives trucks, but every mile marker he passes fills him with dread. He watches them carefully, checking to make sure the numbers always change, always advance, never repeat. And he wonders how many other sections of highway are like this, how many other markers hide these temporal traps, how many other drivers have been caught in loops they can't escape. The highway system spans thousands of miles, countless markers, infinite possibilities for reality to break down. Mile marker 3 in Arizona is just one failure point, one place where the rules stop working. How many others are out there, waiting for unsuspecting drivers to stumble into their embrace? Victor doesn't know. But he drives carefully now, eyes always on the markers, always checking, always counting, making sure the numbers always change. Because the mile that repeats is still out there, still waiting, still collecting trucks and drivers, and trapping them in its eternal moment. And somewhere, in some timeline or dimension, Victor is still driving it, still passing mile marker 3 over and over, still trying to escape, still fading into transparency. That version of him will never deliver his load, will never reach Los Angeles, will never go home. He's there forever, caught in the mile that repeats, just one more ghost on a highway that remembers everything and lets nothing go. Story 7. The Passenger Who Knew the Future. Leonard Shaw had been driving for 31 years when he picked up the passenger who changed everything. May 17th, 2016, somewhere on Highway 93 between Las Vegas and Phoenix, in the deep desert night, where civilization felt like a distant memory. Leonard was hauling restaurant supplies, running behind schedule because of a delayed loading dock in Nevada, pushing to make his delivery window in Tempe. At 2:34 a.m., his headlights caught a figure standing by the roadside. A young woman, maybe 25, wearing ordinary clothes, a backpack slung over one shoulder. Her thumb was out, the classic hitchhikers pose, something Leonard hadn't seen in years. Nobody hitchhiked anymore, not in the age of cell phones and rideshare apps. Leonard's company policy was clear. No passengers, ever, no exceptions. His own instincts echoed the policy. Picking up strangers on lonely highways was asking for trouble. But something made him slow down anyway. Something he couldn't quite articulate. The woman looked tired, looked desperate, and Leonard had daughters himself. He couldn't just leave someone stranded in the desert. He pulled over. The woman jogged to his cab, and Leonard rolled down the passenger window. Up close, she looked even younger, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, and eyes that seemed too old for her face. "Need a ride?" Leonard asked, already regretting stopping. "Yes," she said simply. "To Phoenix. I need to get to Phoenix before morning." "I'm only going as far as Tempe," Leonard said. "That's close enough." She nodded and climbed in without waiting for further permission. The cab light came on briefly, and Leonard saw her backpack was old and worn, covered with patches from national parks and tourist attractions. She settled into the passenger seat and buckled her seatbelt with practiced ease. Leonard pulled back onto the highway, feeling uneasy but not sure why. The woman seemed normal enough, polite, quiet. She smelled like dessert dust and sage, not unpleasant, but distinctly of this place. "Thank you for stopping," she said after a few minutes of silence. "Not many people would." "Company policy says I shouldn't," Leonard admitted. "But I couldn't just leave you out there. I know, she said, and something about the way she said it made Leonard glance at her. She was looking straight ahead, her face illuminated by the dashboard lights. You're a good man, Leonard Shaw. That's why I chose you. Leonard felt ice form in his stomach. I didn't tell you my name. No, she agreed, but I know it anyway. Just like I know you have 3 daughters, Emily, Sarah, and Rebecca. Just like I know Emily is pregnant with your first grandchild, though she hasn't told you yet. Just like I know you've been thinking about retirement, wondering if you have enough saved, if you can afford to stop driving. Leonard's hands tightened on the wheel. He should pull over, should tell this woman to get out, should call the police. But he couldn't seem to do any of those things. Who are you? What do you want? My name is Cassandra, she said, and I want to save your life. My life isn't in danger, Leonard said, trying to keep his voice steady. It is, Cassandra replied. In exactly 47 miles, at 3:16 a.m., a drunk driver in a pickup truck is going to cross the median and hit you head-on. The impact will kill you instantly. Your truck will catch fire. And by the time emergency services arrive, there will be nothing left to recover. Your daughters will never get to bury you. Emily will name her son Leonard after you, but she'll grow up without knowing her grandfather. Leonard's breath caught in his chest. That's not funny. That's not something to joke about. I'm not joking, Cassandra said. I'm telling you what's going to happen. What will happen if we don't change it? You're insane, Leonard said, reaching for his phone. I'm calling the police. You won't get a signal, Cassandra said. Not out here, not for another 20 miles. By the time you do, it'll be too late to avoid the accident. You need to listen to me, Leonard. I'm trying to help. Leonard checked his phone. No signal, just as she'd said. He felt panic rising, mixing with anger. How do you know these things? How do you know about my family? Because I've already lived through this, Cassandra said. I've lived through this moment 17 times now. 17 times I've stood on that roadside, waiting for a truck to pass, trying to warn the driver. Most of them won't stop. A few stop but won't listen. You're the first one who's given me a chance to explain. Explain what? That you're some kind of psychic? That you can see the future? Not the future, Cassandra corrected. The past. From where I'm standing, this has already happened. I'm from 2031, Leonard, 15 years ahead of you. And I've been sent back to this moment, to this night, to try to prevent your death. Leonard wanted to laugh, wanted to dismiss this as delusion or drugs or some elaborate prank. But there was something in Cassandra's voice, something in her eyes, that made him hesitate. That's impossible. Time travel isn't real. It isn't in 2016, Cassandra agreed. But in 2031, it is. Limited, expensive, dangerous, but real. And it's used very sparingly, only for critical moments. Your death qualifies as critical. Why? I'm just a truck driver. I'm not important. You're important to the future, Cassandra said. Emily's son, the grandson you'll never meet if you die tonight, is named Leonard Shaw Jr. In my timeline, the one where you die, he grows up angry, troubled, makes bad choices. By 2030, he's in prison for armed robbery. But in the timelines where you survive, where you're there to be his grandfather, everything changes. He becomes a teacher, helps hundreds of kids in underprivileged communities, starts a foundation that changes lives. Your survival creates a better future, not just for your family, but for hundreds of people. Leonard's head was spinning. This was too much, too strange, too impossible. But Cassandra wasn't finished. In 11 miles, You're going to see a rest area. Pull in there. Stay for 1 hour. That's all it takes. The drunk driver will pass by, will crash into a different truck further down the highway. That driver survives, has minor injuries. But if you're on this highway at 3:16, you die, and the timeline branches toward darkness. Why should I believe you? Leonard demanded. Give me proof. Tell me something that's going to happen, something you couldn't possibly know. Cassandra pulled out her phone, an older model, cracked screen. She scrolled through it and showed Leonard a photo. It was him, but older, gray-haired, holding a baby. That's you and Leonard Jr., she said. Taken in 2019, 3 years from now. You're at the hospital, meeting your grandson for the first time. Leonard looked at the photo. It could be faked, photoshopped. But something about it felt real, felt true. He could see the joy in his own face, the tired wonder of a new grandfather. In 3 miles, there's a dead coyote on the side of the road, Cassandra said. Mile marker 147. You'll see it on the right shoulder. Leonard watched the mile markers. 144, 145, 146. At 147, his headlights illuminated a dead coyote, exactly where Cassandra had predicted. In 7 miles, you'll pass another truck, white freightliner with Texas plates, hauling furniture, she continued. The driver's name is Marcus, and he's listening to country music with his window down. You'll hear it as you pass. 7 miles later, a white freightliner appeared, Texas plates visible in Leonard's headlights. As they passed, Leonard heard country music drifting from the other truck's open window. The rest area is coming up, Cassandra said. Make your choice, Leonard. Pull in and live, or keep driving and die. I can't force you. Time travel doesn't work that way. You have to choose, have to exercise your free will. That's the only way to create a new timeline branch. Leonard saw the rest area sign. Services, 2 miles. His mind was racing. This was insane, impossible, couldn't be real. But Cassandra had known his name, known about his daughters, predicted the coyote and the other truck. And that photo, that image of him holding a baby that didn't exist yet, felt more real than anything he'd experienced in years. If I stop, Leonard said slowly, what happens to you? I return to my time, Cassandra said. Mission accomplished. Timeline branched. I get to go home. And if I don't stop? I try again, she said. Reset to the same moment, same roadside. Wait for another driver. Keep trying until someone listens, or until I run out of attempts. Time travel has limits, Leonard. I can only jump back 17 times. You're my 17th attempt. If you don't listen, I fail, and your timeline continues toward darkness. The rest area exit was approaching. Leonard's hands were sweating on the wheel. Every rational part of his mind said this was crazy, said he should ignore this strange woman and keep driving. But another part, the part that had survived 31 years on the road by trusting instinct, was screaming at him to stop. Tell me something, Leonard said. Something about the future. Something good. Cassandra smiled, and it was the first time Leonard had seen her smile. She looked younger, more hopeful. Emily's son becomes a teacher because of you. You tell him stories about the places you've seen, the people you've met on the road. You teach him that the world is big and beautiful and worth exploring. He remembers those lessons, carries them with him, passes them on to his students. And one of those students grows up to cure a disease, to save thousands of lives, to make the future brighter. All because you pulled into a rest area at 2:58 a.m. on May 17th, 2016, and chose to live. Leonard took the exit. He pulled into the rest area, parked his truck, and shut off the engine. The clock on his dash showed 2:58 a.m., exactly as Cassandra had said. "Thank you," Cassandra said softly. "You don't know how much this means. How many people you just saved." "What happens now?" Leonard asked. "Now you wait," she said. 1 hour. At 3:16, if you look south on the highway, you'll see flashing lights, emergency vehicles responding to an accident. A different truck, a different driver, but he'll survive with minor injuries. And you'll go on to meet your grandson, to tell him stories, to change the future. Cassandra opened the passenger door and stepped down from the cab. Leonard started to follow her, to ask more questions, to get more answers about this impossible situation. But when he opened his own door, she was gone, completely vanished, as if she'd never been there at all. Leonard searched the rest area, looked in the bathrooms, checked the parking lot. No sign of her anywhere. The only evidence she'd existed at all was a slight indentation in the passenger seat, a faint smell of sage and desert dust. He sat in his truck, watching the clock. Minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. 3, 3:05, 3:10. At 3:16, exactly, Leonard saw lights to the south, red and blue, flashing urgently. Emergency vehicles racing down the highway toward some incident. Leonard called his dispatcher, told her he'd pulled in for a mandatory rest break, would be delayed by an hour. She grumbled, but accepted it. He sat there in the darkness, thinking about Cassandra, about time travel, about grandsons who didn't exist yet, and futures that branched in different directions based on choices made in rest area parking lots. When the hour was up, Leonard got back on the highway. He passed the accident site, saw the wreckage being cleared. A pickup truck had crossed the median, hit a commercial truck head-on. The truck driver was standing on the shoulder, talking to police, obviously shaken but alive. The pickup driver was being loaded into an ambulance, also alive. That could have been me, Leonard thought. That should have been me. Instead, a woman from the future stood by a roadside and changed everything. Leonard completed his delivery in Tempe, then called Emily. She picked up on the third ring, groggy and confused. "Dad? It's 5 in the morning. Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Leonard said, and realized it was true, was more true than it had been in years. "I just wanted to tell you I love you. Tell Sarah and Rebecca, too." "I love you too, Dad," Emily said, clearly confused but pleased. "Are you sure you're okay?" "Better than okay," Leonard said. "Hey, when's the next time you're all coming to visit?" 3 months later, Emily called with news. She was pregnant, expecting a boy in January. Leonard cried when he heard, actually cried, tears streaming down his face, as Emily laughed and asked what was wrong. "Nothing's wrong," Leonard said. "Everything's perfect. Listen, I have an idea for the baby's name." Leonard Shaw Jr. was born on January 14th, 2017. Leonard was there at the hospital, was the first person besides Emily and her husband to hold him. The baby looked up at him with dark, curious eyes, and Leonard remembered the photo Cassandra had shown him. This exact moment captured 15 years ahead. Leonard retired 2 years later, spent his time being a grandfather, telling stories, showing Leonard Jr. maps and pictures of all the places he'd driven. He taught his grandson about the beauty of the open road, the dignity of honest work, the importance of connecting with people from all walks of life. Leonard Jr. grew up curious and compassionate. He became a teacher, just as Cassandra had predicted, working in Title I schools, helping kids who came from difficult backgrounds. He told everyone that his grandfather had inspired him, had shown him that the world was bigger than his problems, that you could go anywhere and be anything if you just kept moving forward. Leonard never saw Cassandra again, never heard from her, never got any confirmation that she'd been real. But he knew, on the anniversary of that night, May 17th every year, he'd drive back to that stretch of Highway 93, pull into the same rest area, and wait. Just in case she appeared again, just in case she needed help changing another timeline. She never did. But Leonard always went, always waited, always remembered the night a woman from the future saved his life and changed everything. Leonard Shaw died in 2029, peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by family. He was 83 years old. Leonard Jr. was there, holding his grandfather's hand, telling him one more time how much he'd meant, how much he'd inspired. And in his other hand, Leonard Jr. held a phone, showing his grandfather a photo. It was a picture of a classroom, 30 kids smiling at the camera. "These are my students this year, Grandpa," Leonard Jr. said. 30 lives you helped change, just by being you, just by teaching me to care. Leonard smiled, squeezed his grandson's hand, and closed his eyes for the last time. And in that final moment, he thought he saw her. Cassandra, standing in the corner of the room, smiling that same hopeful smile. She nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, of completion, and then she was gone, fading like morning mist. Mission accomplished, timeline secured, future brightened, all because one truck driver took an exit, believed an impossible story, and chose to live. The highway stretches on forever, connecting past and future, carrying drivers through time and space. And sometimes, on certain nights, in certain places, the impossible becomes real. A woman from the future stands by the roadside, waiting for the right person to stop. A mile repeats endlessly, trapping drivers in temporal loops. A load changes weight, growing heavier with each passing hour. Voices call out from CB static, ghosts of drivers past seeking connection. The highway remembers everything. Every driver who's ever traveled its length. Every story that's unfolded on its asphalt surface. Every choice that's branched the timeline in new directions. And for those who listen, who pay attention, who stop when they're supposed to keep moving, the highway reveals its secrets. Leonard Shaw listened. And because of that, countless lives were changed, countless futures brightened, all because one man, on one night, chose to believe the impossible and pull into a rest area. The highway still runs through the Arizona desert, past that same rest area, mile after mile of empty road under endless sky. And sometimes, late at night, drivers report seeing a young woman standing by the roadside, thumb out, backpack over her shoulder. Most don't stop. A few do, hear an impossible story, make a choice that changes everything. The highway goes on forever. And so do its stories, echoing through time, waiting for the next driver brave enough to listen.